Chapter 1. Introduction to 1 Maccabees. 1 Maccabees is a book that tells the story of a time when the Jewish people faced great trouble and oppression. This book is not part of the regular Bible in many Christian traditions, but it is included in the Apocrypha, a collection of books that provide history and wisdom related to the Jewish faith during the time between the Old and New Testaments. It focuses on a period when the Jews were living under the rule of the Seleucid Empire, led by King Antiochus IV. This was a difficult time for the Jewish people because they were forced to give up many of their traditions and follow the ways of the Greek rulers. The book begins by explaining how the Seleucid Empire had come to power and what happened when King Antiochus IV came to rule. Antiochus was a ruthless king who wanted to make all his subjects follow Greek customs and religion. He believed that if everyone followed Greek ways, it would create a more powerful empire. This meant that the Jews, who were used to living by the laws of the Torah, were in danger. Antiochus wanted them to stop worshiping God the way they had been doing for centuries and instead worship false gods. He made laws that forbade the Jews from keeping their religious customs, like observing the Sabbath, circumcising their children, and offering sacrifices in the temple. The story begins with the Greek army attacking Jerusalem, setting up statues of false gods in the Jewish temple, and forcing the Jewish people to worship idols. This led to a rebellion that would change the course of history for the Jewish people. The rebellion was led by a man named Maccabees, and later his sons, including the famous Judas Maccabeus. They fought back against the forces of Antiochus, risking their lives to protect their faith, their people, and their way of life. 1 Maccabees gives us a detailed account of how this struggle unfolded. It shares the events of the rebellion and the courage of the Jewish people who fought to restore their freedom and religious practices. While the book is not considered part of the official Bible for many Christian denominations, it still contains valuable lessons about faith, courage, and standing up for what is right. In this book, the story of the Maccabean revolt shows us the importance of having faith in God during difficult times. The Jewish people faced oppression, persecution, and even death because they refused to abandon their beliefs. Despite these hardships, they stood strong, trusting in God's help, and fought to regain their religious freedom. This is why the Maccabean revolt is so significant. It shows us that even when things seem impossible, God can help us overcome challenges and protect our faith. 1 Maccabees also introduces us to some key themes that run throughout the entire Bible. One of these is the idea of religious freedom. The book shows how precious it is to be able to worship God freely, without fear or interference. It teaches us that the right to practice our faith is something worth fighting for. This is an important lesson for all of us, reminding us that the freedom to worship God is a gift that should never be taken for granted. Another important theme in 1 Maccabees is the power of unity. The Jewish people, under the leadership of Maccabees and his sons, came together as one to fight against their oppressors. When they united, they became strong and able to accomplish what seemed impossible. This is a powerful reminder of how important it is for people to work together toward a common goal, especially when facing challenges. We see in the story that when we support one another and stand firm in our beliefs, we can make a difference in the world. The book also highlights the importance of courage. The Maccabees did not back down in the face of danger. They could have easily given up, but instead, they chose to stand firm in their faith, no matter what it cost them. Their courage inspired others to join the fight and help them achieve victory. In the same way, we are called to be brave in our own lives, especially when standing up for what is right and true. Throughout 1 Maccabees, we also see how God's hand was with the Jewish people. Even when the odds were stacked against them, they were able to win battles and find strength because they trusted in God. It is clear that God was with them during their struggles, guiding them and helping them to succeed. This is an important reminder for us all, that no matter how difficult our situations may be, we are never alone. God is with us, and He will give us the strength we need to endure. As the story progresses, we see how the Maccabees were able to take back the temple in Jerusalem and rededicate it to God. This event, known as the rededication of the temple, is the origin of the Jewish holiday Hanukkah. It celebrates the miracle of the oil that lasted for 8 days, even though there was only enough oil for 1 day. This miracle reminded the Jewish people that even in times of hardship, God's presence is with them, and that he is able to make a way when there seems to be no way. 1 Maccabees is not just a history lesson. It is a story of hope, perseverance, and the power of God's faithfulness. While it tells us about a particular time in history, it also speaks to our lives today. The lessons from the book are timeless, reminding us that no matter what struggles we face, we can find strength and courage through our faith in God. Whether we are facing personal difficulties, standing up for what we believe in, or working together with others to bring about change, the message of 1 Maccabees is clear. With God's help, we can overcome anything. The story of the Maccabean revolt in 1 Maccabees serves as a powerful example of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. It teaches us the importance of faith, courage, and unity, and it reminds us that God is always with us, no matter what challenges we face. The book encourages us to live boldly in our faith, to trust in God's provision, and to fight for our beliefs, just as the Jewish people did during the time of the Maccabees. 1 Maccabees is a reminder that our faith should never be taken for granted. We should be thankful for the freedom we have to worship God, and we should be ready to stand up for it when necessary. It also teaches us that no matter how dark the days may seem, God's light is always shining, guiding us through every trial and struggle. Just as the Maccabees were victorious through their trust in God, we too can find victory in our own lives when we rely on His strength and power. This book, though not part of the traditional canon of Scripture in many Christian denominations, still offers us deep lessons in faith, courage, and perseverance. Its message speaks across time, reminding us of the enduring truths of God's faithfulness, the power of unity, and the importance of standing firm in our beliefs. Just as the Jewish people fought for their religious freedom centuries ago, we too are called to live boldly in our faith, trusting that God is with us every step of the way. The story of 1 Maccabees is not just a part of ancient history. It is a message for us today, showing us that with God's help, we too can face any challenge and emerge victorious. Chapter 2. Secret 1. The importance of religious freedom. Religious freedom is something many of us take for granted today. In many parts of the world, people are free to worship God in any way they choose, without fear of punishment or persecution. But this was not always the case, and it was certainly not the case for the Jewish people during the time of 1 Maccabees. The story in this book is one of struggle and resistance, as the Jewish people fought to maintain the right to practice their faith in a world that was trying to take it away. This chapter highlights the importance of religious freedom and the lengths to which the Jewish people had to go to preserve it. The events in 1 Maccabees begin when the Greek king Antiochus IV Epiphanes took control of Jerusalem. Antiochus was a king who believed in spreading Greek culture and religion. He wanted all of his subjects, including the Jewish people, to abandon their old ways and worship the Greek gods. This was a huge problem for the Jewish people because their faith was deeply connected to the worship of the one true God, the God of Israel. Their entire way of life, how they lived, how they prayed, how they taught their children, was centered around their worship of God. Antiochus's decree meant that the Jews would no longer be able to practice their faith freely. In 1 Maccabees, we read about how Antiochus issued laws that specifically targeted the Jewish religion. He commanded that all Jews must abandon their traditional practices. The Sabbath, a day of rest and worship, was outlawed. The Jewish people were forced to worship the gods of Greece, and anyone who refused faced severe punishment. The book of 1 Maccabees tells us that Antiochus even went so far as to set up a statue of Zeus, a Greek god, in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. This act was not just an insult to the Jewish people. It was an attempt to erase their faith entirely. In 1 Maccabees 1:41-42, we read about the decree that Antiochus issued. Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that every one should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. The king was trying to unite his empire by forcing everyone to follow the same religion and the same customs. This was a time of great danger for the Jewish people, because following the king's orders meant abandoning their faith. The book of 1 Maccabees makes it clear how important it was to the Jewish people to keep their faith, even in the face of such intense pressure. The Jewish people were determined to remain true to their God, even though it meant facing the wrath of the king. They knew that religious freedom was not just about following certain customs. It was about maintaining their identity as a people and staying true to the covenant they had with God. For them, the right to worship God was worth fighting for. The importance of religious freedom becomes even clearer when we read about the actions of Maccabees, a Jewish priest who was living at the time. Maccabees refused to bow down to the Greek gods or to offer sacrifices to them. He knew that doing so would be a betrayal of his faith and his people. In 1 Maccabees 2:19-20, we see Maccabees' response when he was asked to offer a sacrifice to the Greek gods. Then Maccabees answered and spake with a loud voice, "Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons walk in the covenant of our fathers." Maccabees' refusal to follow the king's orders was an act of great courage. He understood that religious freedom was not something that could be taken for granted. He knew that standing up for his faith was more important than pleasing the king or avoiding trouble. His words show us that, even in the face of great pressure, he was determined to remain faithful to the God of Israel. Maccabees' actions inspired many others to join the fight for religious freedom, and his courage became the spark that ignited the Maccabean revolt. Maccabees' defiance did not come without consequences. He was not the only one who resisted the king's orders. Other Jews also stood up for their faith, and many of them paid the price for doing so. Some were tortured, some were killed, but their actions were an example to others of the power of standing up for religious freedom. In 1 Maccabees 2:23, we see that Maccabees called on others to join him. Then Maccabees and his sons rent their clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned very sore. This was a sign of mourning, but also a declaration of resistance. It showed that they would not give up their faith, no matter the cost. Religious freedom is not just about being able to worship in a building or on a specific day of the week. It is about being able to live in a way that is true to one's beliefs. For the Jewish people in 1 Maccabees, religious freedom meant more than just going to the temple to offer sacrifices. It was about living in a way that honored God in every part of their lives, how they worked, how they ate, and how they treated each other. Antiochus' decrees were an attack on the very way of life that the Jewish people had known for generations. This is why the fight for religious freedom was so important to them. The importance of religious freedom is not just a lesson from history. It is something that we can learn from today. The story of the Maccabees teaches us that we should never take our right to worship God for granted. The ability to practice our faith freely is a gift, and it is something worth protecting. We should be grateful for the freedoms we have and remember that there are many people in the world today who are still fighting for the right to worship God in the way they believe. In addition to protecting religious freedom for ourselves, the story of 1 Maccabees teaches us that we should also stand up for the religious freedom of others. The Maccabees did not just fight for their own right to worship. They fought for the right of all Jews to practice their faith freely. They understood that religious freedom is not something that should be denied to anyone. Today, we can follow their example by supporting those who are facing persecution for their faith, whether they are in other countries or even in our own communities. As we reflect on the importance of religious freedom, it is clear that the story of 1 Maccabees is one that speaks to us across the ages. It is a story of courage, conviction, and a deep desire to stay faithful to God, even in the face of overwhelming pressure. The Jewish people's struggle for religious freedom was not just a fight for their own rights. It was a fight for the right to worship God freely, without fear of persecution. Their story reminds us that our faith is worth standing up for and that we must never take our right to worship for granted. The lessons from 1 Maccabees are still relevant today. The fight for religious freedom is an ongoing battle, and we must continue to protect this right for ourselves and for others. We should be inspired by the courage of Maccabees and his sons, who refused to compromise their faith, and we should be ready to stand firm in our own beliefs, no matter the cost. Whether we are facing pressure in our own lives or standing up for the rights of others, we can remember the example of the Maccabees and the importance of religion. Chapter 3. Secret 2. The Power of Unity in Adversity. In the story of 1 Maccabees, we see how the Jewish people faced enormous challenges, yet their greatest strength came from their unity. Despite being under the rule of a harsh and oppressive king, Antiochus IV, who sought to destroy their faith and culture, the Jewish people stood together. Their ability to unite in the face of such adversity was not only a source of strength, but also the key to their success in the Maccabean revolt. This chapter reveals the power of unity when facing difficult times, and it shows us how coming together can help us overcome the greatest of challenges. When Antiochus IV issued his decrees forcing the Jews to abandon their faith, worship idols, and follow Greek customs, many Jewish people were fearful. The king's power seemed overwhelming, and the threat of death for anyone who resisted was very real. It would have been easy for the people to scatter and give in to the pressure. But instead of falling apart, the Jewish people came together to fight for their right to worship God and keep their traditions. The strength of their unity gave them the courage to stand against a powerful empire. One of the first acts of defiance came from Maccabees, a Jewish priest who refused to follow the king's orders. When the king's officials came to his town and demanded that he offer sacrifices to the Greek gods, Maccabees knew he had to act. In 1 Maccabees 2:19-20, Maccabees speaks up and says, "Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons walk in the covenant of our fathers." Maccabees' words show that he was not willing to compromise his faith, no matter what. But what is even more powerful in this moment is that Maccabees didn't just stand alone. His stand for faith inspired others to join him. When Maccabees made his stand, he called on his sons and the people of Israel to join him in resisting the king's demands. His call was one for unity in the face of adversity. In 1 Maccabees 2:23, we read that Maccabees and his sons rent their clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned very sore. This mourning was not just a personal act. It was a public declaration that they were united in their grief and their resolve to fight for their faith. The people saw this and recognized that this was a moment where they needed to unite, or they would lose everything. The unity among the Jewish people grew as others joined Maccabees in his rebellion. People from all over Israel began to gather and form a resistance against Antiochus' oppression. In 1 Maccabees 2:27-28, we see Maccabees calling for all who were loyal to God to join him in his fight. Then Maccabees cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, "Whosoever is zealous of the law and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me." This was not just a call to fight, it was a call to come together, to unite in the cause of defending their faith and freedom. The power of unity is clear as we continue through the book of 1 Maccabees. As more and more people joined the rebellion, they formed an army that was able to stand against the Greek forces. They didn't have the resources or the numbers to match the might of Antiochus' army, but they had something far more powerful: unity and faith in their cause. They were united in their love for God and in their desire to restore their right to worship him freely. This unity gave them the courage to take on the mighty forces of the Greek Empire. In 1 Maccabees 3:17-18, we see how the Jewish people, led by Judas Maccabeus, continued to fight despite the odds. But Judas said, "It is no hard matter for many to be shut up in the hands of a few, and with the God of heaven it is all one, to deliver with a great multitude or a small company." Judas Maccabeus understood that the power of the Jewish people was not in their numbers, but in their unity and faith in God. He knew that if they stood together, they could accomplish what seemed impossible. The power of unity is not just about being together physically. It's about being united in purpose. The Jewish people, despite their differences, came together for a common goal: to fight for their freedom to worship God. Each person in the group knew their role and was determined to do their part. Some fought in battle, while others supported the cause in different ways, but they were all working toward the same goal. This unity made them strong, and it allowed them to accomplish great things, even against overwhelming odds. As we reflect on the lessons from 1 Maccabees, we see that the power of unity is still relevant today. When we face challenges, whether in our personal lives or as a community, it is important to remember that we are stronger when we stand together. Unity gives us the strength to overcome obstacles that may seem impossible to face alone. It is through working together, supporting one another, and sharing a common purpose that we find the strength to persevere. In our world today, there are still many forces that seek to divide us. Whether it is in our families, our communities, or our nations, division can weaken us and make it harder to achieve our goals. But when we come together, united in purpose and in faith, we can accomplish great things. Just as the Jewish people in 1 Maccabees were able to stand up against a mighty empire because of their unity, we too can face adversity and overcome challenges by standing together. Unity is also about trust. The Jewish people trusted each other and trusted in their leaders. They knew that, although they were fighting a powerful enemy, they could rely on one another to do their part. In 1 Maccabees 3:19-20, we see that trust was key to their victory. For the victory of battle standeth, not in the multitude of an host, but strength cometh from heaven. The people understood that their strength came from God, but that they had to work together to see God's power at work. In our own lives, we too need to trust each other and trust in God's plan for us. When we face difficulties, we should lean on one another and come together as a community. By supporting each other, we can find the strength to face any trial, no matter how big or small. The lesson from 1 Maccabees is clear. When we unite in faith and purpose, we become stronger and more capable of overcoming the challenges we face. Another important aspect of unity is perseverance. The Jewish people in 1 Maccabees did not give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. They faced tremendous obstacles and hardships, but their unity and faith kept them moving forward. In 1 Maccabees 3:58-60, we see the determination of the Jewish people. But Judas said, "We will not be afraid of the multitude of the heathen who come against us, but remember how our fathers were delivered in the Red Sea, when Pharaoh pursued them with his army." They remembered the miracles of the past, and this gave them the courage to keep going. The lesson of perseverance is one we can all apply in our lives. When we face difficulties, we should not give up. We should remember the strength we have when we stand together, and we should trust that, with God's help, we can overcome anything. The Jewish people in 1 Maccabees knew that they had a higher purpose, and that purpose gave them the strength to endure. In the end, the power of unity was what allowed the Jewish people to defeat the armies of Antiochus and restore their freedom to worship God. The Maccabean revolt shows us that when we come together in faith, we are stronger than we are alone. The power of unity in adversity is something that can change the course of history, and it is something that can change our lives today. As we face challenges in our own lives, we should remember the example of the Jewish people in 1 Maccabees. When we stand together, supporting one another, and trusting in God's strength, we can overcome any obstacle. The power of unity is not just about being together. It's about coming together with a common purpose, supporting one another, and trusting that God will guide us through. Whether we face personal struggles or larger challenges, we can always find strength in unity. And just as the Maccabees were victorious in their fight for religious freedom, we too can find victory when we stand together in faith and unity. Chapter 4, Secret 3, Faith in Action. In the book of 1 Maccabees, we learn about the importance of having faith, but also about the crucial step that follows, putting that faith into action. Faith is not just a belief or feeling. It is something that must be shown through our actions. Throughout 1 Maccabees, we see how the Jewish people didn't just trust in God, but they took that trust and turned it into decisive, courageous actions. Their faith in God was the foundation of their resistance against Antiochus, but it was their actions that brought them victory. This chapter reveals the power of faith when it is acted upon and how it can lead to remarkable outcomes, even in the face of great challenges. The story begins with Mattathias, a priest who was determined not to follow the king's orders to sacrifice to false gods. Mattathias had faith in God and in the traditions of his people, but that faith wasn't just something he kept in his heart. He acted on it. In 1 Maccabees 2:20, Mattathias says, "Yet will I and my sons walk in the covenant of our fathers." This was not just a statement of belief, it was a call to action. Mattathias knew that faith meant standing firm, even when it was dangerous. He had the courage to oppose the king's command, and this act of defiance stirred others to do the same. Mattathias's actions weren't just about refusing to worship idols. They were about leading others in their faith. In 1 Maccabees 2:27, it says, "Then Mattathias cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, 'Whosoever is zealous of the law and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me.'" Mattathias was not just saying that he would follow God's law, but he was also inviting others to join him in his actions. He wasn't content to simply hold his beliefs in private. He was willing to make his faith public and take a stand for what was right. The people who heard Mattathias's call were inspired to act. The strength of their faith was not just in believing that God would help them, but in their willingness to fight for what they knew was right. In 1 Maccabees 2:42-43, it says, "Then were assembled unto him a company of the Hasmoneans, mighty men of Israel, every one that offered himself willingly for the law." This shows that faith in action inspired others to take a stand too. The resistance wasn't just one person fighting against an empire. It became a movement. And the people weren't just following Mattathias. They were following the call to live by God's law and to defend their right to worship him. When Mattathias passed away, his son Judas Maccabeus took up the cause. Judas was a leader who understood the importance of putting faith into action. He didn't just talk about what he believed. He led his people with courage and strength. In 1 Maccabees 3:16-18, we see that Judas wasn't afraid of the odds against him. And when they saw the host coming to meet them, they said, "How shall we be able, being so few, to fight against so great a multitude and so strong?" But Judas trusted in God and knew that faith was not just about numbers. It was about God's power and his willingness to fight for those who trusted in him. In the next verse, Judas says, "With them is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." Judas understood that faith meant trusting God to act, but also acting himself. Judas and his army were outnumbered, but their faith and their actions together led to a victory that seemed impossible. The key here was that faith was not passive, it was active. They didn't wait for God to do everything for them. They fought with all their strength, knowing that God was on their side. This is what true faith in action looks like. Doing everything we can, while trusting that God will give us the strength to face challenges that are beyond our own abilities. Throughout 1 Maccabees, we see many examples of the power of faith in action. When the Jewish people faced hardship, they didn't just pray and wait for things to get better. They acted. They fought. They resisted. They stood up for their faith, even when it seemed like there was no hope. In 1 Maccabees 3:24-25, we see a powerful example of how their actions matched their faith. "And they smote the host of Timotheus, and that day were slain of the host of Timotheus about 3,000 men." Their faith in God didn't just make them passive bystanders. It made them active participants in their own deliverance. Faith in action doesn't just apply to wars or battles. It applies to all areas of life. In our own lives, we may face struggles, but God calls us to act on our faith. We can't just sit back and hope that things will improve on their own. Like the Jewish people in 1 Maccabees, we are called to act in faith, trusting that God will help us along the way. When we face difficulties, we need to take action, whether it is in fighting for justice, standing up for what is right, or simply trusting God to guide us through tough times. In 1 Maccabees 4:30-31, after a great battle, we see how the Jewish people didn't forget to praise God for their victories, for they saw the help that was from God, and they rejoiced in the God of heaven. This shows that faith in action is also about remembering to give credit to God for the help he provides. They didn't think that they had done it all on their own. They knew that their actions were made possible by God's power, and they gave him thanks. This idea of faith in action is repeated in many other parts of the Bible. In James 2, verse 17, it says, "Even so faith, if it hath not works, is dead, being alone." This means that faith by itself is not enough. We need to show our faith through our actions. Just like the people in 1 Maccabees, our faith should drive us to do what is right and to act when it is needed. In Matthew 17, verse 20, Jesus tells us, "If ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you." This shows that even the smallest faith can lead to great results if we are willing to act on it. The key is not just believing in God, but acting in the confidence that He will guide and empower us to do what is right. In our daily lives, faith in action means trusting God when we face challenges, but it also means taking the necessary steps to do our part. If we want to change something, we have to act on it. If we want to improve our lives or help others, we have to step out in faith and take action. Just like the people in 1 Maccabees, we must not wait for things to happen, but take steps forward, knowing that God is with us. The final victory in 1 Maccabees comes when the Jewish people reclaim the temple, which had been desecrated by the Greeks. In 1 Maccabees 4:36, it says, "Then Judas and his brethren said, Behold, our enemies are discomfited. Let us go up to cleanse and dedicate the sanctuary." Their victory wasn't just about defeating their enemies. It was about restoring their faith and their relationship with God. This act of cleansing the temple was a powerful demonstration of their faith in action. They didn't just want to restore their physical freedom. They wanted to restore their spiritual connection with God. Faith in action means working to restore what has been lost or broken. It means trusting in God's power to make things right and doing everything we can to help bring about that change. The Jewish people in 1 Maccabees knew that their faith was not just about winning battles. It was about honoring God and living in accordance with His will. They acted on their faith, and through their actions, they saw God's power at work. In the end, the story of 1 Maccabees teaches us that faith must be lived out through action. We can't just believe in God. We must act on that belief, trusting that God will be with us every step of the way. When we face challenges, we are called to step forward in faith, doing our part while trusting that God will empower us to overcome. Whether it's fighting for what is right, standing up for our beliefs, or working to make the world a better place, faith in action can lead to incredible results. Just as the Jewish people in 1 Maccabees saw victory through their faith and their actions, so too can we find victory when we put our faith into action. Chapter 5. Secret 4. God's Sovereignty in Human Struggles. In the book of 1 Maccabees, we are given a powerful view of God's sovereignty in human struggles. This means that even when things look difficult or hopeless, God is still in control. The people of Israel faced many challenges in the time of the Maccabees. They were under the rule of a powerful enemy, King Antiochus, who wanted them to turn away from their faith and worship false gods. Despite being greatly outnumbered and facing overwhelming odds, the Jewish people were able to overcome because of their faith in God's sovereignty. One of the most important truths we can learn from 1 Maccabees is that no matter what struggles we face, God is always in control. He works through human history, guiding events to fulfill His purposes, even when it seems like things are falling apart. The people of Israel faced great suffering under Antiochus, yet their faith and trust in God allowed them to persevere. At the beginning of 1 Maccabees, we see the cruel reign of Antiochus, who made many laws that were against the Jewish people. He outlawed their traditions, their practices, and their very faith. In 1 Maccabees 1:41, it says, "Moreover, King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and that every one should leave his laws." This was a clear attempt to destroy the Jewish faith and force them to become like everyone else. Antiochus thought he could erase God's people by forcing them to abandon their beliefs, but he underestimated God's power. Even in the face of such oppression, God was working behind the scenes. Maccabees, a priest, knew that he could not allow this evil to continue. He knew that God was still in control, and he acted in faith. In 1 Maccabees 2:19, Mattathias says, "Although all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons walk in the covenant of our fathers." Mattathias did not give in to the pressure of the world around him. He trusted that God would be with him, and he chose to take a stand. His faith in God's sovereignty gave him the courage to resist. The victory of the Jewish people did not come easily, and it did not happen in a way that people expected. God's sovereignty often works in ways that are beyond human understanding. The Jews were outnumbered, weak, and under great oppression. But God worked through their struggles to bring about victory. When Mattathias died, his son Judas Maccabeus took up the leadership and continued to trust in God. In 1 Maccabees 3:18, Judas says, "With them is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." Judas understood that it wasn't their own strength that would win the battles. It was God's power at work in them. He trusted that God's sovereignty would bring them through, even when things looked impossible. In many ways, the victories the Jewish people experienced under Judas Maccabeus were miracles. They faced armies that were much larger and stronger than their own, but they trusted in God's sovereignty, and God fought on their behalf. In 1 Maccabees 3:24, it says, "And when they saw the host coming to meet them, they said, 'How shall we be able, being so few, to fight against so great a multitude and so strong?'" Their faith did not allow them to focus on their limitations. Instead, they trusted that God would provide what they needed. And in verse 25, Judas responded, "With them is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles." This statement shows the confidence they had in God's sovereignty, knowing that God would fight for them. When they went into battle, they did so with the assurance that God was in control. Even when they faced overwhelming odds, they did not lose hope. They had faith that God was leading them and that he was with them. In 1 Maccabees 3:26-27, we see that the enemy's forces were defeated, so they joined battle, and the enemy was defeated. This victory wasn't because the Jewish people were stronger or more skilled in battle. It was because God was with them. God used their struggles to show his power, and he led them to victory. The Jewish people in 1 Maccabees didn't just experience God's sovereignty in battle. They saw it in the way God worked in their hearts and lives. In 1 Maccabees 4:8-10, when they were able to rededicate the temple, it was a moment where they could see the fulfillment of God's promises. Now on the 25th day of the 9th month, even in the month Caslu, in the 148th year, they rose up betimes in the morning and offered sacrifice according to the law upon the new altar of burnt offerings. After their struggles, they had a moment to remember that God was with them, and that he had provided a way for them to restore their worship. The story of 1 Maccabees reminds us that God is always in control, even in the midst of our struggles. When we face difficulties, it can be easy to feel like we are alone or that God is distant. But the book of 1 Maccabees shows us that, even in the darkest moments, God is sovereign. He is working through the struggles, even when we can't see it. The Jewish people had to trust God's sovereignty to survive and to fight for their faith. They didn't know what the outcome would be, but they believed that God would lead them through. In our own lives, we can trust in God's sovereignty in the midst of our struggles. We may face difficulties that seem impossible to overcome, but we can be sure that God is in control. He has a purpose for our lives, and he will use our struggles to bring about his plans. In Romans 8:28, it says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." This verse reminds us that no matter what we go through, God is working it out for our good. Just like the Jewish people in 1 Maccabees, we can trust that God is in control and that he is working through our struggles for his glory. God's sovereignty doesn't mean that we will never face difficulties, but it means that, even in those difficulties, God is in charge. He can take our struggles and turn them into something good. When the Jewish people were under oppression, they did not know how they would overcome, but they trusted in God. In 1 Maccabees 4:30, it says, "For they saw the help that was from God, and they rejoiced in the God of heaven." They understood that their victories were not because of their own strength, but because of God's help. We too can have this same confidence in our struggles, knowing that God is with us, working through our lives to bring about His purposes. As we reflect on the story of 1 Maccabees, we are reminded that no matter what we face, God's sovereignty remains true. His plans for us are bigger than we can understand, and He works in ways that we cannot always see. But we can be confident that He is in control. We may face battles in our lives, but we can take courage knowing that God is fighting for us. When we trust in His sovereignty, we can find peace, even in the midst of struggle, knowing that He is working all things for our good. In the end, the Jewish people's faith in God's sovereignty led to their victory. It wasn't just their own efforts, but God working through them that brought them success. We too can trust in God's sovereignty, knowing that He will work in our lives to bring us through our struggles and lead us to victory. Whatever challenges we face, we can take comfort in the truth that God is in control, and He will never leave us or forsake us. Through our faith in His sovereignty, we can overcome any obstacle and live with the confidence that God is always with us. Chapter 6. Secret 5. The importance of dedication. The book of 1 Maccabees teaches us many lessons about faith, courage, and the power of God. But one of the most important lessons we can learn from the story is the importance of dedication. Dedication means staying committed to a goal or belief, no matter what challenges come along. It's about being faithful and loyal to what you know is right, even when things are difficult. The people in 1 Maccabees had to be dedicated to their faith in God, their people, and their way of life. It was their dedication that helped them endure the struggles they faced and ultimately led them to victory. In 1 Maccabees, we see how the Jewish people were faced with the challenge of being faithful to God while living under the rule of a foreign king, Antiochus. This king wanted to force the Jewish people to abandon their faith, to stop following God's laws, and to worship false gods. Antiochus made laws that were meant to destroy the Jewish faith. But the people of Israel were determined to stay true to God. They did not give up their beliefs, and they did not let the pressure from their enemies make them turn away from God. Their dedication to God was the reason they were able to fight and overcome their enemies. The first person we meet in the story who shows dedication is Maccabees, a priest in Jerusalem. He knew the importance of standing firm in his faith, and he refused to give in to the pressures of King Antiochus. When the king's officials came to him and tried to force him to make a sacrifice to the false gods, Maccabees was not afraid. He refused. In 1 Maccabees 2:15-16, it says, "Then the king's officers who were enforcing the decrees came to the town of Modin to make them offer sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Maccabees and his sons were assembled. The officials wanted Maccabees to obey the king's laws, but Maccabees knew he could not. He had dedicated his life to serving God, and he would not turn his back on that commitment. Maccabees stood up and boldly declared, 'Though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him, and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers, and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons walk in the covenant of our fathers.' 1 Maccabees 2:19. He made it clear that no matter what, he would stay dedicated to God's law, just as his ancestors had done. This was a powerful moment of dedication. Maccabees knew that if he gave in, he would be helping to destroy the very thing that made him who he was, his faith in God. His commitment to God was stronger than any fear or threat. He was dedicated to his people, his faith, and his God, and he would not give up. Maccabees passed on this dedication to his sons. When he died, his son Judas Maccabeus took over leadership and continued the fight. Judas was just as dedicated to the cause as his father had been. He didn't back down, no matter how difficult things became. He knew that the only way to truly protect his people was to stay faithful to God and to lead with dedication. In 1 Maccabees 3:17-18, we read, "And when they saw the host coming to meet them, they said, 'How shall we be able, being so few, to fight against so great a multitude and so strong? The Jewish people were greatly outnumbered, but Judas and his men trusted in God's help. They were dedicated to the mission, and they knew that God would be with them. Judas's dedication didn't stop with just fighting battles. He also wanted to restore the Jewish way of life, including their worship of God. After a great victory, Judas and his soldiers went to the temple to rededicate it to God. This moment was very important because the temple had been defiled by the enemies, but Judas's dedication to God led him to clean and restore it. In 1 Maccabees 4:36-37, it says, "Then Judas and his brethren said, 'Behold, our enemies are discomfited. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it.' And all the hosts assembled themselves together and went up into Mount Zion." This was a clear sign of how dedicated Judas was to honoring God and making sure that the worship of the true God would continue. They didn't just fight to survive. They fought to restore their faith and to honor God in everything they did. Throughout 1 Maccabees, we see how the dedication of the Jewish people to God, their faith, and their way of life helped them to overcome the greatest obstacles. They were determined to stay true to their beliefs, even when their enemies tried to destroy them. This level of commitment and dedication is a powerful reminder for us today. When we face challenges in life, we can look to the example of the Maccabees and remember that dedication to our faith can help us overcome any obstacle. One of the most important aspects of dedication is that it involves sacrifice. In 1 Maccabees, we see that many of the Jewish people had to sacrifice their time, their energy, and even their lives in order to stay faithful to God. Maccabees, for example, had to sacrifice his peace and comfort to stand up for what was right. His sons had to sacrifice their safety in order to fight for their people. Even after the battle, they had to sacrifice in order to restore their way of worship. Dedication is not always easy. It often requires sacrifices, but these sacrifices are made for a greater cause. Just as Maccabees and his sons sacrificed their comfort for the sake of God's law, we too are called to sacrifice things in our lives in order to stay true to our faith. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about the importance of dedication when he says, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Luke 9, verse 23. Jesus is calling his followers to a life of dedication, one where we put aside our own desires in order to follow him. Just as the Maccabees were dedicated to standing up for their faith and protecting their people, we are called to be dedicated to following Jesus and living according to his teachings. This doesn't mean that life will always be easy, but it does mean that our dedication will lead to something far greater. In our lives today, we may not face the same battles as the people of 1 Maccabees, but we still face struggles and challenges that can test our dedication. We live in a world that often pressures us to compromise our faith and values. But like Maccabees, Judas, and the rest of the Jewish people, we are called to stand firm in our dedication to God. We are called to trust in his strength, just as they trusted in God's help to fight their battles. We may not have to physically fight battles like they did, but we are called to dedicate our lives to living for God every day. The importance of dedication cannot be overstated. When we are dedicated to our faith, we are able to overcome the challenges that life throws at us. Dedication is not just about what we do when things are easy, but what we are willing to do when things are difficult. The story of the Maccabees shows us that God honors our dedication and that when we are faithful to him, he will guide us and help us to fulfill the purpose he has for our lives. So, just as the Maccabees showed great dedication to their faith, we too are called to live with that same dedication. We can be confident that with God's help, our dedication will lead to victory, no matter the obstacles. Like the Maccabees, we can fight the battles that come our way, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. And just as Judas Maccabeus and his people rededicated the temple to God, we too can rededicate our hearts to God, keeping our commitment to him strong, no matter what life brings. Our dedication to God is the key to living a faithful and victorious life. Chapter 7. Conclusion. The legacy and relevance of 1 Maccabees. The book of 1 Maccabees is an important part of history. It tells us about the struggles and triumphs of the Jewish people during a time of great persecution. Through their stories, we learn many lessons that are still relevant to us today. The legacy of 1 Maccabees is not just about battles or ancient kings. It's about the strength of faith, the power of unity, and the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it's hard. The book shows us how dedication to God can bring about great victories and how trusting in His guidance can lead us through even the most difficult times. 1 Maccabees tells the story of how the Jewish people were under the rule of a foreign king named Antiochus IV. This king was determined to force the Jewish people to abandon their faith in God and adopt the ways of his people. He outlawed the worship of God and forced the people to worship idols. Many Jewish people were afraid to stand up to this pressure, but there were some who were dedicated to God and refused to give in. One of the greatest lessons we learn from this book is the importance of standing firm in our faith, just like the Maccabees did. They didn't allow fear or threats to make them abandon their beliefs. They knew that their faith in God was more important than anything else. The story begins with Maccabees, a priest who was determined to stay true to God's law. When the king's officials came to him and demanded that he make sacrifices to idols, Maccabees refused. He was not afraid of what might happen to him. He knew that obeying God was more important than obeying a king who wanted to destroy his faith. His courage inspired others to do the same. Maccabees and his sons became leaders of the Jewish people, and they fought back against the forces that were trying to destroy their faith. This is an important lesson for us today. When we stand firm in our faith, we can inspire others to do the same. After Maccabees died, his son Judas Maccabeus took over the leadership of the people. Judas was a man of great courage and faith. Even though the Jewish people were greatly outnumbered by their enemies, they trusted in God's power to help them. Judas led them in battle, and through their dedication and trust in God, they were victorious. The battles in 1 Maccabees are not just about fighting for land or power. They're about fighting to protect the faith and the right to worship God. In the end, after their victory, the Jewish people rededicated the temple in Jerusalem to God, showing that their true victory was in restoring their faith and their way of life. The importance of rededicating the temple was not just about restoring a building. It was about reminding the people that God was the true ruler and that their lives should be dedicated to Him. The rededication of the temple symbolizes a turning point in the Jewish people's relationship with God. They had faced great trials, but by standing firm in their faith, they had come through victorious. This act of rededication teaches us that even when we face challenges in life, we can always turn back to God and renew our commitment to Him. It's never too late to make a fresh start in our relationship with God, just as the Jewish people did with their temple. The legacy of 1 Maccabees is also about the power of unity. When the Jewish people were united in their faith and in their cause, they were able to accomplish great things. They did not fight alone. They fought together, supporting one another and trusting in God's help. In the face of great opposition, their unity made them strong. Today, we can learn from this example. We are called to be united as believers in Christ, supporting one another, and working together to stand for what is right. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul encourages us to be united in faith. In Philippians 2 verse 2, Paul says, "Fulfill ye my joy, that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind." This is the kind of unity we see in the story of 1 Maccabees. When the people came together, they were able to fight for their faith and their freedom. Another important lesson from 1 Maccabees is the role of leadership. The Maccabees showed us that leadership is not about power or control. It's about serving others and being dedicated to a cause. Maccabees and his sons were not fighting for personal glory, but to protect their people and honor God. Their leadership was built on faith, sacrifice, and selflessness. This is the kind of leadership that we are called to have in our own lives. Whether we are leaders in our families, communities, or workplaces, we are called to lead with integrity and a heart for service, just as the Maccabees did. The story of the Maccabees also teaches us the importance of perseverance. The battles they fought were not easy. They faced many difficulties, and they often seemed outmatched by their enemies. But they kept going, trusting that God would give them the strength they needed. In 1 Maccabees 3:18, Judas Maccabeus says, "With him is the strength to help them that are fallen, and to lift up the weak." Even when things seemed impossible, they never gave up because they believed that God was with them. This is a powerful message for us today. Life can be hard, and we may face challenges that seem too big to handle. But like the Maccabees, we can trust that God will be with us and give us the strength to persevere. The lessons from 1 Maccabees are not just for those who lived during that time. They are for us today as well. We live in a world where people face many challenges to their faith. Just like the Maccabees, we may face pressure to compromise our beliefs or follow the ways of the world. But the story of 1 Maccabees reminds us that we can stand firm in our faith, just as they did. We can be dedicated to God, unite with others who share our faith, and lead with courage and integrity. The relevance of 1 Maccabees extends beyond just lessons for personal faith. It also teaches us about the importance of standing up for justice and what is right. The Maccabees fought not only for their faith, but for the freedom of their people. They did not allow injustice to go unchecked. In today's world, there are many people who still face persecution and injustice because of their beliefs. The story of the Maccabees encourages us to speak out against injustice and stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. Finally, the book of 1 Maccabees teaches us about the importance of remembering our history. The Jewish people remembered their victories and the lessons they had learned from their struggles. They knew that their faith had brought them through difficult times, and they celebrated God's faithfulness. By remembering their history, they were able to keep their faith strong and continue to pass it on to future generations. As Christians, it's important for us to remember the history of our faith, from the victories of the early church to the lessons we learn from Scripture. Remembering God's faithfulness in the past gives the legacy of 1 Maccabees continues to speak to us today. It teaches us about the importance of standing firm in our faith, trusting in God, and living with dedication. It reminds us of the power of unity, the role of leadership, the need for perseverance, and the call to stand up for what is right. These are lessons we can apply in our own lives as we seek to honor God and live according to His will. The book of 1 Maccabees may be an ancient story, but its message is timeless, and its relevance continues to impact us today. By learning from their example, we can face the challenges of our own lives with courage, faith, and a heart dedicated to God. If you have enjoyed learning about this text and want to learn more about God's Word, check out our other videos here.